Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this session. The session is called "What is Learning Experience Design?" and as it we made instructional design, we make instructional design obsolete. Yeah, thank you actually for some people have started turning on their cameras. We really appreciate that. We're hoping to have a pretty good discussion going on in this session. So I just want to, I'm the chair of the session and we'll let you in. We'll have a discussion in a sec, and Saul will start his presentation, but there's just a few little things I want to mention before we get started. There is closed captioning available for this presentation. You just have to go to the like more option within a Zoom and you can turn it on if you want. It's not too bad. The other thing is, if we are recording the session and it will be posted up at some point through the Saltese website. So if you are not comfortable and you don't want your image and so forth visible in the recording, you can just turn off your camera and change your name if you want. Other than that, I think we're good. So I'm going to hand it over to Saul and he can start presenting. You're muted.
Thanks. I thought I clicked unmute, but apparently I really screwed that one up. Anyway, it's really nice to see you. I see, and I see, like, because I see your faces. I see a number of familiar faces here, as well as some new people. And then I don't see some faces because your cameras are off. But it's nice. Nice to see you all. I'm really glad that you're all here today. And we are here today to talk about learning experience design. And this is based on work with my two colleagues, Giuliana Cucinelli and Leelan Farhan. We've written an article on it, and one day we're hoping there are a bunch of peer reviewers who will like it. In the meantime, we'll present the workshop. So today we're going to talk about what is learning experience design and does it render instructional design obsolete? And considering that I'm seeing many of my former instructional design students here, I think that's probably relevant to you all. But before I begin, I'd like to share a territorial acknowledgement. And this is a territorial acknowledgement for Concordia. And as many of you may be aware, Concordia is located on the unceded territory of the I apologize for the name, Kanen'haka or Mohawk, and is a place that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. And I just want to acknowledge that, especially in light of the recent events. Now, in this session, we're going to explore by doing, so let's get to it. What I want you to do is we're going to start off together. We're going to look at the first unit of a tutorial. And when doing so, I want you to consider certain questions. Although you're only going to see one unit of it, consider, first of all, what is the end result? That is, what should learners be able to do after they complete this tutorial? And speaking of those learners, who are they? And then finally, given this first unit, what is the likelihood that learners will be able to successfully accomplish the goal? And the tutorial is one that's in the public domain. It is the ethics tutorial for the Tri-Council, which oversees research by all researchers in science, natural sciences, engineering, healthcare, humanities, and social sciences in Canada. So I'm just going to sign in so that we have a record of this, and we're going to go back and we're going to look at the first module. And this is, I'm going to really quickly, you want to go back to the home. This is the home page. So this is where you actually get started.
Although you have to
So
switch.
we're not seeing it.
Oh, wait, I got to stop sharing and share. Thank you for reminding me.
Yeah.
I apologize for the screw up at my end and appreciate your catching that for me. So here we are at the beginning of the TPS2 core tutorial. This is the first page. And I'm going to log in. And I've already, since I have worked with this before, I'm logged in. And then I can, I have a number of different things that I can do here. So we're going to go into looking at the objectives of the first unit. But before we do, I'm going to go back to this home screen. Other than log in, can you get to the first, can you think about, can you get to the very first unit without logging in? And with that in mind, we're actually going to go to that first unit, and we have the objectives, and take a second to read these. I'm not going to read aloud because you can do that all by yourselves, I hope. Then the next screen is the introduction. So take a second to read this, and then I'm going to actually click on the link that's here. And we have a link here, and you hover over it, and you may see it. It's kind of tiny. It says REB, Research Ethics Board. And I'm going to hover over examples, which is actually a link. And it says, if you're not able to access some of the media examples in your area, this will not affect your ability to do the exercises or complete the module. And then we go to the Stanford prison experiments. We'll go into this. And this is an external link outside the tutorial. When you're finished, close. So here is this, and you can read. And then we'll go into the slideshow. Take a second to read it. I don't expect you to read it in depth, but I do want to give you a chance to at least read some of it. So we have the volunteers. Next. Next. In the interest of time, I'm going to go to the grievances. I'm going to go a little quickly through here. Notice the guard section has like 4 or 5 different areas. We have this rebellion. There was a rebellion on site. That's several slides, several more slides, several more slides. Then we continue with this. Then we get to the grievances. Take a second to look at this. Then we have the escape. A little bit more on the escape. Take a second to review. A little bit more on the escape. And then look at the discussion. And then we have more of this and the discussion. And then there's the conclusion. I'm going to close this. And it doesn't close. So I'm moving back because it doesn't seem to want to close. and then just close the thing. So we've gone through that. So then we go to the next. Imagine yourself as a participant. You have choose one of the options. Since most of us are in education, if you don't mind, I'm just going to choose the social sciences path first. So imagine this, read this option. So then the next one, so then thinking through ethics. And the foundation. So we'll click on the first one, respect for persons. And then there's a click here. And you can listen. There's a 5-minute audio and a 26-minute audio. We're not going to do that. So I'm going to close that. How to apply respect for persons. Consider participant autonomy. Consider these factors. Consider dignity, and you notice that they display stuff here. Concern for welfare. If I click on this time, now there's nothing to click on. There's a stolen laptop video. In the interest of time, I'm just going to skip this. Then how to apply the concern for welfare. And then I didn't notice, I just clicked next and it automatically would be, hold on. So it automatically, if I just click next, whether I clicked it here, I clicked it over under next, it was going to show me the text on the right. And then we get back to the concern for welfare, sorry. And then how to apply. And it's going to just walk me through these different bullet points one at a time, whether I click on the bullet point or whether I just click on next. Then there's justice. And I'll click on fairness. And it's a definition. I have to exit out. I can't escape it out. And then how to apply it. Hold on. Once again, it's the same thing where you just click through a bunch of paragraphs. Anyway, it's got click one or more interactive cases. We'll stick with the social sciences. And then you have to answer some questions. So I want you to rank order strategies from best to worst. And let's just do something here. So it actually gives me the answers while I click over them. So I'm just going to submit it as is. And they have a different order for the experts. Then there's the summary. And then there's different agencies. And then you take a quiz, which we're not going to take. And I'm going to stop sharing that. I'm going to go back to my participants and share screen again. And let's do a little work. So need your help with this one because I need you to chat. What should learners be able to do after completing this tutorial based on what you've seen? What should learners be able to do when they complete this tutorial? Okay, one person has no idea. Okay, that's fine. There's no right or wrong answer. Anybody else have any thoughts? Identify ethics in research. Okay, other thoughts? Describe ethical guidelines, be able to use human participants in a trial, plan a proper research plan, know what not to do in research project when enrolling participants, apply an ethical approach to research methodologies. So you're all kind of gravitating towards the same thing, but it's all in the knowledge realm for the most part, or applying an ethical realm. And I'd say this is pretty accurate. I think that's pretty fair. So let's move on to the next slide. And I know the intention because I had to take this module, but the application is unclear. Andrea, please hold on to that thought. We're going to explore that in greater depth. By the way, who are those learners? Who are the learners for this? Researchers, people interested in doing research, and students, members of the research ethics, REB or Research Ethics Board members, faculty, graduate students in Canada, managers in charge of research. Really, these are really good. I mean, I think you're making a good guess. The truth is that on the one hand, it's anyone involved in research. So that could be students, it's going to be faculty, it'll be other researchers, managers in charge of research. Catherine definitely knows that job pretty well. And it applies to Canada, and it could be conducting it in Canada. The corresponding tutorials in the United States, they apply to anybody in the world. Could it be the participants? They technically could take it, but they're not required to take it. Given the first unit, so you've only seen a sample, so I'm asking you to make a huge leap here. But given the first unit, in your estimation, what is the likelihood that learners will be able to successfully accomplish the goal of conducting ethical research? In your estimation, what do you think the likelihood is based on if they take this tutorial, when they finish it and take all 8 units of it, what do you think the likelihood is that they're going to accomplish the goal of conducting ethical research? What's your personal assessment? We're getting a lot of likely. We have 0.0007%. I love the precision there. Maybe slightly better than without, but not great. Low if this is their only resource. 7 out of 10. Nicholas, you are probably more optimistic than anybody else here. That doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means you're more optimistic. Low, I'd say not likely. Yeah. It's I share the concern. And let me ask you a couple more questions. To what extent do you think the designers actually have considered the learners? And I have a number of different particular aspects of the learners. So the first one is objectives and learning content. So ranging on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being they didn't consider their learners at all, to 10, they were top of mind. They were like really super important. And 5 or 6 somewhere in the middle. Where do you think this fits? Where do you think in terms of area 1? And if you want to share, why did you give it this number? So we're getting in the middling range, and we have a few on the lower end. We don't see any 7s or above. We're seeing in the middle of the range. They've thought a little bit about it. They considered what they want to teach. They haven't considered the other piece of it, what the learners should do with it. The examples seem very remote. It's heavy on content, not great. Where the people developing the tutorial instructional designers. Hold off on that question. Can't seem really dry. Let's move on to the next area. I've got 5 more of these areas I want you to assess. Area 2, the level of writing. Was it attuned, like focused on the learners? In other words, where the learner was, and granted, it could be, it was broadly defined in this case. Did it seem geared towards where people were in terms of the writing? And that's both the level of language as well as the stories and the technical knowledge. Not considering international grad students, they gave some definitions, 6 in the middle of the range there, yeah. And we're getting, once again, we got a couple 7s here, which is good. Caroline feels like it lacked content. All right, let's move on to the next question. Remember, I've got 6 of these for you. Distinctions among the needs of different segments of the audience. To what extent did they consider that? Distinctions among the needs of different segments of the audience. Nicholas says 2. Monica says 2. Andrew gives them a 5 because they have 3. They have a bunch of different fields, different segments. Right now, however you choose to define it, I'm going to share later. It seemed to be aimed at a single audience, Carol feels. Okay. Any other thoughts on this one? Let's move on to the next one, the readability of the screen. In other words, just how well the screen kind of directed the eye and made it easy, made it a pleasant, not particularly tiring reading experience. Okay, I guess one person used letters and together they spell the word ew. Everyone else is using numbers that really come in. I think Selena gives it the best mark of 3, but everyone's kind of down there at the end. Next one, navigation. That is, how easily could people figure out where to go and move from screen to screen? We have a whopping 0, which wasn't even on the scale, so it must be really bad. We have 1, we have a 4. Some of these are big, but generally we're not giving high marks for this one. It's fake. You can't really go where you want. Yeah, you got that one, Jen. And we've got area number 6, the fun factor. How fun was this? In other words, would people, not fun in the sense like going to La Ronde or amusement park. I'm thinking more fun like as in, I'm not going to fall asleep while taking this course. We have -10, which wasn't even an option there. From the 90s, but not good in a retro way. Yes, 10. It has a high fun factor, -10. Okay, yeah. 1.5. Thanks, Justin. Yeah, it's, we have a solid 1 from Carla. Cool. All right. Well, this is the essence of learning experience design, the issues that I just asked you about. And these are considerations of objectives and learning goals, while also considering things like the level of the writing. Is it aimed towards people? Distinctions among the needs of different segments of the audience. The readability of screen design. Navigation, getting from place A to place B. And finally, the fun factor. I know many of you are instructional designers who design both classroom and e-learning, and you're always concerned about engaging your learners and making things interactive. And when we talk about that, we're not necessarily talking about a commercial game, but we are talking about the fact that we don't, at the very least, don't want our students to start snoring in class. At the very least, that's annoying to other people. And at the most, they're not going to learn anything. So that's really what learning experience design is. And the reason, and some of you've taken my instructional design course are also aware that I love to use this course as my whipping boy, so to speak, of bad instruction. This is a really important topic, how to conduct ethical research, because there have been some awful abuses in that Stanford experiment. And I encourage you to go and read more about that. That was a highly unethical study. But what they're trying to do with this, at its most noble, is to inspire researchers to conduct ethical research. And I'm not sure that this tutorial does a particularly good job. I will say, compared to other ones in this genre of tutorial, in other words, other research, required research ethics tutorials, I would say it's kind of in the middle of the pack. There are other ones that are worse. I've never found one that I thought really kind of gets what this is all about. And really, when that question I asked at the beginning, and this gets to the distinction among the needs of different segments of the audience. The only way that these authors have segmented their audience is by people who work in the natural sciences, healthcare, and or health research, and social sciences and humanities. And the reason they did that is because there are 3 funding agencies for research and engineering in the natural sciences, health research, and humanities and social sciences that ultimately are working together to create this tutorial. But that's not the real distinction among their audience. It's part of it, it's one, but it's not the most significant. You've got primary investigators who need to go through this because they're designing studies and they will have to fill out an ethics application, which is not even addressed at great length in this tutorial, and for which people really need a tutorial on how to complete it. You have graduate students who come in a couple of different varieties. Some will be working as research assistants on a project that has already been approved, and therefore they're inheriting an already accepted research protocol. And they can go to their employer or their professor and say, what's the approved protocol? Because the rest professor has to have it. In other cases, they're going to be graduate students who are going to have to create their own. And so they will also need this, or they may need both because they're right now working for their professor, but they're going to be doing their own protocol for their own study. And then finally, you have members of the public who, for a variety of different reasons, need to be aware of research ethics. They may be serving on a research ethics board, in which case there should be training for that. Or they may just simply be a participant in a study who wants to understand what should have been approved and why things are the way they are. But that distinction has never happened in this. It's just lumped into this one happy little thing. The writing is kind of dense on a couple of different levels. In terms of the language, it's relatively, that language is somewhat accessible. I wouldn't say it's a perfect job, but it's not as awful as I've seen other ones be. On the other hand, the paragraphs are long and they're dense. And that particular example of the Stanford experiment, while a wonderfully rich example, is too long to introduce this. They should have produced their own. For the number of users, they could have afforded to produce a short video that very quickly summarizes this experiment or something like it for the purpose of this. This is the introduction. You want to seduce people in, and I use that in a content way. So in other words, I say I want to seduce, you want people to gain, you want to gain their attention and make them want to learn more. They want them to think that this is an important topic and then make them feel responsible to learn more about it. I would say after the Stanford experiment, which is almost a half a century old, it is not standard of the kind of research ethics problems that happen today. I think it's probably not the best lead-off one. The second one, which we did not go through, is a much better example. It's an example of a professor who puts everything on their laptop. The laptop is stolen, and the data on the laptop, the research data, which is really super sensitive, is now available for ransom to whoever wants to do something nasty with it. That's scary. That's real. And those kinds of issues are as recent as the last 48 hours when we were hearing news about all kinds of breaches of private data. Readability of the screen design. Screen design can make something either easier to read or harder to read. Navigation, just simply how you get about this stuff. This was based partly on standards that had been in effect for the Government of Canada websites. So they were somewhat limited, but even the Government of Canada started realizing its own web design was so restrictive that it made it hard to use their sites. And I've talked a little bit about the fun factor, but given a choice, it's not that you should try to use false games and all kinds of other, gimmicks to make people interested in your program. But all other things being equal, if you can find a way to tap into the passion and interest of your learners to get them to continue with the program and mentally engage them and emotionally engage them, it's more likely that they're going to finish the program and be interested in what you're teaching. And this is the essence of what learning experience design is. And it emerged over the past 10 years. And the focus has been on preparing instructional materials. And the term has been used in job titles. There may be some, by the way, does anybody here in this session have the job title of learning experience designer? Anybody here use that? Because I know that Knowledge One, which provides all of the e-learning for Concordia, they use the learning experience designer. I believe McGill has been using it in some of their continuing ed units. Anybody got the job title of learning experience designer? It's also used in competencies for training professionals. The 2016 competency model for training and development professionals from what used to be the Canadian Society for Training and Development, they have a whole competency called learning experience design, and that's designing the actual program. It contrasts with curriculum design, which is designing a series of related programs. And then there are short courses offered by for and not-for-profit organizations that focus on learning experience design. So what exactly is learning experience design? Well, it utilizes a well-established user experience design, service design, and design thinking methods to focus the design of synchronous and asynchronous learning experiences on those who matter the most, the learners. And this is from a guy named Niels Flohr, who claims to have founded learning experience design in 2007. So there was a learning design manifesto that came out in 2019, and it calls Designers of Online Learning Experiences to Transform Learning into a More Personal and Profound Experience. And it invites learners to tell designers what drives you so that I can truly meaningful learning experiences that have powerful positive impact. And the real concept is actually rooted in a much broader, better known, and more established field called user experience design. And let me just ask, how many of you have heard of learning of user experience design? How many people have heard of that? Yes. By the way, what is user experience design? What is user experience design? For those of you, a lot of you are familiar with it. Anybody know what a user experience design is? It's about looking at the user's journey. It's about following that path from the time the individual first engages with whatever it is that you want them to engage with. And it could be, although we mostly focus on software, it can just as much be a shopping experience or an offline experience. And it goes all the way till they have successfully completed whatever interaction they're supposed to have with you. So if it's a shopping interaction, it would be from the time they maybe check you out in a list of stores on a directory, they go in the store, how they're greeted in the store, how easily they can find the merchandise they're of interest, how well they're treated by the staff, how easy the checkout experience is, and how pleasant they feel upon leaving. It could be a museum where it's like, how easily could they find the museum? How easily could they get in there? Was it hard to get through the admission desk? Could they find the exhibit? Were they able to get through the exhibit easily? Were they able to understand the exhibit? Did they enjoy the exhibit, et cetera, et cetera? And so a lot of the comments in the chat really kind of characterize this. There are a few experiences that are kind of central to user experience design. They're not the entire thing, but they are definitely key. One is preparing something called personas. And what a persona, and we'll go through this in a little bit more depth later, but the idea is that we actually begin this process by identifying who our users are, or in this case, learners, and we always think about them. We have some resources we can go back to actually put them in front of our head. Experience mapping is, there are a lot of other different words, and we're going to use them in a few moments, but the idea is I want to I want to create a diagram of that journey from beginning to end, and all the key parts of it, as well as what is it that they're actually doing. Because people, like, I go into a store and I can map the beginning to end, but there's a bigger piece of that. And that is, why did I walk into that store in the first place? Was I, just some kind of, sleepwalking? Or do I need to purchase a particular piece of equipment or a particular piece of clothing? Or was I just merely curious and just wanted to satisfy my curiosity? There's no right or wrong, but if you have a better idea of what actually drove somebody into that place, the rest of that experience starts to have a broader context, and you can design for that. And the other one is prototyping. In other words, before we actually just roll something out and say, here it is, use it, we say, all right, here's what we're thinking about doing. How would you respond to that? What would be easy for you? What would be hard for you? You being you, the learner, or you, the user. And these are all from the online learning. These particular characteristics come from the Online Learning Consortium, which used to be the Sloan C Foundation, and it's a major purveyor of e-learning practice in the field. So when was it founded? Flora claims to have founded it in 2007, but there's actually some evidence that the concept of learning experience design is rooted in a similar concept called the quality of the learning experience that can trace its roots back to 1989. And I like this definition because I think it's really appropriate for learning experience design. Students' perception of the direct and indirect inputs that they receive from their college. By the way, it doesn't have to be limited to college. It could be university, it could be workplace, it could be Con Ed, anything. By direct inputs, we mean college investments in the educational programs in terms of content, resources, etc. The primary difference is the instructional medium, classroom versus online. That was the 1989. They didn't really, it's not that online didn't exist in 89. It's just it was such a minuscule part of the portfolio. It wasn't really on people's radar. And the student perceptions versus experience. Does learning experience design replace instructional design? So I'm going to give you a little crash, like 2-minute overview of instructional design. ID emerged in the 1940s, believe it or not, as part of the effort in World War II. And it was focused on designing instructional experiences. And it was really specifically focused on designing programs as efficiently as possible and designing them so that learners would develop the skills most effectively and within the shortest period of time. And there was a real need here. What happened was there was all kinds of new technology being introduced into the battlefield. And the quicker they could get people through the training, the quicker they could launch those new technologies in the field. Now, there's a whole other side of ethics about whether, what was going on with what the nature of the technology they were dealing with. That's for another day, but this is just simply the roots of the field. And it was rooted in cognitive psychology. And many of you may be aware that BF and behavioral psychology, I should say, not just cognitive psychology. And BF Skinner is really kind of at the forefront a lot of the developments of instructional design. And many of his proteges were actually key in developing the field. People like Gagne and Bob Mager and like that. Instructional design really has 3 components. There's instructional design theories, which offer explicit guidance on how to better help people learn and develop. There's instructional design itself, which refers to strategies for structuring content and content to ensure that they are most effectively teach the intended material. The choices should ideally be rooted in empirical research on effective instructional techniques. And then finally, there's instructional systems design, which is what we usually teach in instructional design classes. And that refers to the process that people follow. So instructional systems design is the process. Instructional design is actually the act that people use to create, it's actually the act that people use to create particular parts of the instructional experience. And professionals get focused on the process. And I think that's one of the reasons why learning experience design has arisen, because learning experience design actually aligns better with really the first and second columns, not the third. Learning experience design is really about focusing on the learners. It's not so much about the process they use to develop the learning itself. And so when you contrast it, here's a quick chart, some roots. You've got cognitive psychology of the mid and 20th century, and also behavioral and academia. Its root. Learning experience design really is something that emerges directly from practice, and it's rooted in usability and user experience design. One thing I think is really important, usability and user experience design actually emerges from a field called ergonomics, which is actually a branch of a field called psychology. Notice that there's a little bit more family relationship here than appears on the surface. The awareness of one another. Instructional design has awareness of learning experience design. I can't tell you it's a reciprocal awareness. In terms of focusing on the process, instructional design is really focused on analysis and evaluation. Learning experience design tends to focus on the design phase. What both of them ignore, however, is that the majority of time is actually invested in the development phase. The main tools for instructional design, it's the process that we follow. For learning experience design, it appears to be personas and learning journeys, as well as some usability testing. But both of them are overlooking development. Instructional design, although called instructional design, it really focuses more on design. It focuses a little bit more on instruction than design. And it also overlooks a lot of practical issues like technology and schedule and budget. And these are also overlooked by learning experience design. It assumes that the instruction is online, which is a false assumption, but it also overlooks the fact that developers only have so much time and so much money to develop. In many cases, it's not a whole lot. And everyone just assumes that there's an unlimited supply of time and unlimited budgets to create things, which I think is a false assumption. My personal concern is that there's parallel conversations that would ideally converge, and learning experience design identifies limits in ID that which focuses more on performance than on the learner, and both ignore development. And I have a question in the chat. When the developer isn't the teacher themselves, that's a really good point. Most instructional designers assume, it's interesting, in different environments, instructional designers may be developing their own material. I happen to be one of those kind of IDs. In higher ed, teachers develop their own classroom materials in many cases, but in other cases, they work with third-party instructional designers to develop them. So there's all kinds of arrangements. And you see the same thing going on in other contexts too. So the real issue isn't the name you use, it's the extent to which you use your programs to help an identified group of learners achieve a designated group of learning objectives. And I've got another comment coming in. Can't we say that learning experience design is part of instructional design? Hold that thought, Aina. It's a really good one. We're going to get to that. So working in small groups, what I want you to do for the time being is to name as many practices as possible that can be used to achieve that goal. So I want you to identify practices and no holds barred, just brainstorm. So just go around in the group and everybody names one. But name practices that can be used to achieve a good, positive learning experience, especially tools practices that you can employ during development, whether they or not are currently part of instructional design as you understand it. And to make that happen, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, and I'm going to send you into breakout. You have to do the breakout rooms. Do you mind doing that? And before we do, someone said an example of a tool. So you may want to use, let's say, instructional objectives to clarify your objectives. That's a tool. That answer your question?
How many breakout rooms would you like to have?
We've got 29 people, so let's do 6 breakout rooms. And I'm going to give you about 7 minutes. So it's 4:27 now. We're going to come back at 4:34. But while we're getting started, just want to start sharing. What ideas did you come up with? So let's go with Carla. Let's start with Carla's group. What did you guys come up with?
Okay, could you restate the question? Because I think I got some water, but I think we nailed it.
You think you nailed it? Okay, that's even better. So let me share the screen. Hold on. Get the right screen up here. Okay. So this is your question. Name as many practices as you can. Just name just 2 that came up in your group that can help people achieve their goals help learners achieve their goal while also creating a great instructional experience.
So we spoke about usability tests.
Yep, excellent choice.
Yeah, so we spoke about that, my personal experience. And also we talked about flexible pathways sometimes in.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Excellent choice. That's not on my list, but it's a really good advanced one. Excellent. So let's go to another group. Andrea and Justin and Nicholas, what did you guys come up with? Name 2 techniques.
One technique we talked about was possibly using a pre-test or an introductory survey just to get a better sense of what learners' needs are, so that the
excellent
content can
idea.
be tailored
Another one that's not on my list. Excellent one though. Keep going.
A second one isn't coming to my head right now. Andrea or Nick, did you want to jump in?
Sure. We were talking about some different ones, but I don't think they were coming from the world of instructional design.
It's okay.
Or learning experience design. Some of the other ones we talked about were more pedagogical practices. So community of inquiry model was another one that someone mentioned.
These are good. Another group, share. Just a couple of these is fine. And also just make sure you're unmuted.
Saul, our group, we talked about having an asynchronous space where people can discuss content. And we also talked about peer assessment and rubrics. And there's a few others I can't remember.
These are all great. And a lot of these are advanced techniques. I'm going to have to go back and look at the transcript of this to make sure I get them into other stuff because I don't have them on my list. But that doesn't make them any less valid. I'm going with the basics. And I've got a chat one. I want to see what this one is. I'll You're welcome for the presentation. Anyway, but so let me share a few of these. I've got about 8. But before I get to those, I want to share a little story. And years ago, I was invited to write a book called Training Design Basics. The original name was going to be Training Design Essentials, but apparently the title got changed. The publisher wanted to change the name of the series. And it was like, it'd be like the 150th book on instructional design. And I kept thinking, my God, what can I write about this? There's so many books on this already. I have nothing to add. And then I really thought about, thank God I'd done a dissertation before that. And it's one of the few really practical insights I got out of my dissertation. And one of them was that a lot of what we have in our instructional design process is a value system about what we think is important, but it may or may not actually have any bearing on how we actually spend our time. And if you look at not so much the one in this book, which a lot of you learned from, but from the really well-known instructional design texts in our field, which would be Dick and Carey and Smith and Reagan, which used to be the text that we used, you would think that almost everybody's time is always spent in analysis and evaluation. And the only way you would know that it wasn't if you read the empirical studies of where people spend their time, which is not in analysis and not in evaluation. Analysis is the one they think they should be spending more time in those, but they spend most of it in development. And my background, I also have a background as a tech writer. And one of the things that our studies show is that you spend about 50% of your time in actual hardcore writing. And I would say that when I worked as an instructional designer, I didn't see it really any differently when I was designing courses that were, and I began my career in the mid 80s in this field. And I never set foot in a classroom for the first 5 years. Yes, before many of you were born. And yes, they did have e-learning then. And our authoring tools were easier, by the way. They made them harder with time just to confuse everybody. And anyway, so I was like, no one talks about development, so I'm going to talk about that. And it turns out that's really where the key of the field, I wrote that book in 2002 and 2003. And you see the learning experience design comes up in 2007. A lot of the issues that were raised there were already being covered by some of the other books, not just mine, but also George Pixarich, who did a really great book on ID, and Bill Horton, who had also wrote a wonderful book on ID. And these are some of the things that people use: personas and use cases, screen design principles, plain language writing, terminology management, pilot or usability testing and templates, learner journey and learner input, and instructor input. And I'm going to talk about each of these very, very briefly. The first one is use cases or scenario, or scenarios, as I apparently misspelled it. But I apologize for that. It's really hard to edit your own work, as I keep telling people, and then I'm a living example of it, unfortunately. But really what they describe is how are learners going to use the material after they master it, either on the job or in future classes. But the idea is not just to say, what are they going to specifically do, but what are some of the conditions under which they're doing it? So you kind of get a sense of the context. It's like what drove this person, if we're going to use shopping as an example, it's not just what's their experience once they walk in the store? What drove them to go into the store? So for example, if someone's going into a hardware store for a plunger, chances are there's a stopped up drain somewhere. And if they have a 1-bathroom home, it's probably really inconvenient. And we'll leave everything else on that one with that image. And so you want to try to get a sense of where people are. And so you can get a sense of what's their mood and their feeling and their motivation, and also how much tolerance they have for crap along the way and how much they want to just get into the main stuff. A related tool is personas, and personas describe the users that you have, and then you get 3 people who are very different from each other within each audience segment. So for the ethics course, you would have faculty researchers, you'd have graduate student researchers, you might have research ethics board members as your audience segments, and you have 3 very different people. And the idea comes from a guy named, the idea of choosing the 3 is really kind of clarified by a guy named Alan Cooper, who said that you want to choose 3 people who are really different from each other. And together they represent about 90% of your user base. So you're probably going to hit everybody if you think about these. And then you literally make up a little profile of this person. And this is one I yanked off of the internet. But you give them names and you actually say, what would Clark think about this? And then if you have, let's say Daisy is another one, it's like, and how would Daisy respond? Because you want to make sure that they're all going to respond in a way that's meaningful to them for the parts that need to be meaningful to them. And you do this throughout the development and you want them all in your head. And the reason you have personas are typical ID techniques, just have them do demographics. So you find out that someone has 12.83 years of education, or that they are 67% of their women. Well, no human being is 67% female, but you'll have 2/3 of your audience is female, 1/3 is male. That gives you something to work with. So you need 1 male and 2 women in this, so you can start to get a sense. And are the gender, is that going to affect how they respond to things? So you want to get that. You want to get them as people. It's easier to think about people than numbers. Screen design principles, which is the third principle. Careful use of design that ensures that learners pay attention to the issues that require it. Easy navigation onto and among screens. So once they're in there, they find stuff there and get to the next place. And also how you design a screen can either make reading a tiresome experience or a pleasant experience. And it's achieved through careful use of typography, white space, visuals, and layout. And just simply the type that you use can, if you're pissed at your users, there's all kinds of nasty things you can do with type to let them know how you feel about them. Plain language writing. That's condensing messages to their clearest, most succinct form. And it's embodied by this bizarre interchange I had very early in my career. There was a guy who was, let's just say, very academic, even though I was working in a corporate life. And he was like, he always would pontificate and say, like, how do you enter a building? He was trying to get like a rhetorical question. Another coworker, kind of really down to earth kind of person, couldn't take his stuff anymore. She goes, through the door. And that's, you kind of want to be the person saying through the door to your readers. And you want to aim at a 8th grade or better, a 6th grade reading level that's not meant to be insulting to your readers. It doesn't mean you take complex subjects and dumb them down. What it does say is you want to explain to people who you can't assume have the background that they need to really fully understand. So you need to explain it clearly. And you want people to get through this easily, the first read. You don't want them reading the same sentence 3, 4, 17 times to make sure they really understand what they said. Terminology management. This is a huge issue. We use like the learning experience design, instructional design, learning engineering, learning science. Our field is awash in terms. The problem is nobody consolidates them and you have no idea. And so people are like, I'm a learning scientist today. You know what? I'll be an instructional designer tomorrow and I'll be a learning experience designer the next day. And here's the deal. That's what most criminals on the FBI most wanted list do. They have a lot of aliases. And it becomes really confusing when you use multiple terms to mean the same thing. Believe it or not, the field of ed tech has another word, instructional technology. And you talk to hardcore ed techers, and there's a difference in instructional technology isn't as good as ed tech. I will speak as the oppressed instructional technologist because that's what my degree is in. And I will tell you, nobody in the rest of the world gives a flying flip about it. No one even knows that there's a difference. So why are we like starting to do all kinds of awful discrimination, and I mean it, based on something that's stupid and nobody even cares about. What's really important, however, is that we find a term and stick with it so that we're consistent. I'm a real fan of acronyms. I hate them. They're stupid. I give my students 2 acronyms per dissertation or thesis or internship report. You can pick any 2, but they better be good. And the reason is, once you get to number 3, everybody forgets all the other ones. So if they're only going to remember 2, that's all you get. And then choose a single term where several exist. Templates. These are like fill-in-the-blank forms that encode the visual design, layouts for particular types of screens, white space, typography, editorial style to a particular extent, and consistent wording when it's really important. Readers notice when you change your instructions. My favorite experience ever in a usability test was, I'd been working on an early e-learning program. We used to say, type your response, then press enter. It was a 28 module course and each one was 30 to 60 minutes. We figured by hour 14 of the program, you were sick of reading that. So we got rid of then press enter. So in hour 15 or module 15, we just shortened type your response, then press enter to type your response. Well, we watched the user. He typed his response and he waited and he waited and he waited and nothing happened because he had to press enter. But he didn't realize he was supposed to press enter because we never told him to. We thought it's getting boring for him, but he was so used to it. He was conditioned. It doesn't matter what I think as the designer. I can be sick and tired and bored silly about writing this stupid instruction. But if that's what the user is expecting or the learner, I better include it because it's not about me. I'm not writing for myself. I can write a novel that nobody's going to read for myself. This is for the learner. And then finally, facilitate navigation because learners automatize it. In other words, you don't think about how you navigate a screen in Windows because you know how to do it. Once you learn Windows, and it was adjustment for people, but once you learn it, you can apply that to everything you use. You can even go to a Mac and use it pretty well. I mean, a few things are in weird places, and within half an hour, you kind of figured out where everything moved around from the Mac that used to be on the Windows and vice versa. And that's what you want. You don't want to put things in weird places that make people think about the navigation. It should be automatic. Pilot or usability testing. They're basically the same thing, but pilot testing is typically used with a class, like a live virtual class like we're doing now, or a face-to-face class. And usability testing is done with self-study learning. And there's a difference between user testing and usability testing. User testing says, do people really need what I'm doing? And do users need my app? Usability testing says, but can they use it? Ideally, you're doing a bit of both, because if they can use it, but they don't need it, it's kind of a problem. If they need it, but they can't use it, that's a huge problem. Ideally, they need it and they can use it, but you want to see it. And by the way, even if you think you are God's gift to humanity when it comes to usability prediction, unfortunately, when you are at if you are as good as the best, you will only get 47% of the problems on your own. You have to see people using it. That's because none of us is a mind reader. And the only way to find out what people are thinking is to watch them use the application. The last one is the learner journey. Usability testing really talks about the course. It's like everything in the course, whether it's, a classroom course, live virtual course, or an online course. But there's the whole experience. And let me put this best. My brother is going back to get a second master's degree. I have never heard my brother so angry because he couldn't figure his way through the blasted systems in his school. He's not going to Concordia, but he couldn't figure out what the hell is this whatever it is. It was Blackboard is the program. He couldn't even remember the name of it. Couldn't figure out how to get through it. He couldn't figure out how to get on it. Had a different sign on than another thing. And it goes on, and everything is in a different place. And I know that we don't exactly the idea is, all right, let's figure out what happens from very beginning to very end to figure out what is this experience for the learner. And I see other people find that Blackboard is problematic. I'm an ex-Blackboard user. I'm a Moodle fan. I love Moodle, but you can use whatever you want to use. It's not my place to. And Moodle didn't pay me for the advertisement, I might add. But the big thing is you want to map that to see where the pain points and what can you do to turn them from pain points to at least smooth running points. And then learner instructor feedback. These is like in the evaluation phase, you're going to get feedback from learners and you're going to get feedback from the instructors who use the stuff that you design. And you know what? They're not all going to be, whoever designed this should be appointed God of the universe or the lead instructional designer for everyone, for all future humanity. They're going to find issues and it's up to us to listen to them. I know I'm probably one of 3 instructors on the face of the earth that does believe in learner feedback on ratemyprofessor.com that everyone else dismisses. And I do know that mostly it's the people who love you or hate you comment on that. And I have both commenting on my work. But there may be a point of truth in both, especially the negative stuff. They may have a valid point. And it's really important for us to listen to it. We may not have nailed that one particular evaluation, but we can address the concern so they don't get that, so the next student doesn't have that experience. And one of the biggest concerns that students have with their feedback that they give us is that we look at it and it goes in the garbage can. The best way we can honor them is to listen to their feedback. But the other thing too is the best way we can provide a great learning experience is to listen to what other learners are telling us. Now, if it's just one learner, it may just be their opinion. But if 17 learners are telling you that there's an issue, trust me, there's an issue there. So we have a few minutes left. So what I'd like to do now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a moment, but I'm going to ask you to share how might you apply the lessons learned in this lesson and what one question remains. But before I do, I have a couple more slides that I want to share. First one, I just want to make you aware of the new Concordia graduate certificate in teaching in higher and continuing education. We're accepting applications for our first cohort until July 15th, and it is designed for for a learner who has something else going on in their lives. It is a part-time program, and it will be done virtually. COVID or no COVID, it's being done virtually. So even when everyone else is back in the classroom, we're going to be in a virtual classroom. And if you want to learn more about learning experience design, I'll put these slides up again in a moment, but there is a real book from the ed tech perspective, and this is a great book. I've actually heard these people speak. They know both sides of it, the learning and the user experience stuff, and they're super passionate about it. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and ask, what's the most important thing you learned, or what questions remain? We've got about 5 minutes left. One question that remains: how to find the right balance between overly prescriptive and setting minimum standards for educational materials? That's a really good question, Justin. I'm going to actually throw it back to you for a second, and feel free to speak if you feel comfortable, using your mic. But what do you think it should be?
Well, I think I got to it a little bit in the message by saying minimum standards. So there needs to be something. But yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of a tricky balance because, especially in a higher education context where you don't want to sort of limit the creativity of the instructor who has the right to make these decisions for their content in their course. But
yeah, I think a lot of it's going to be a lot of it being coded in templates. I think you can't force an instructor to do personas, and you can't force them to do use cases or learning journeys. But the truth is that you can elicit, if you're working with an instructor and you're an instructional designer, you can elicit them some students who are kind of pivotal to the learning experience, who might be bellwether students to think about as they move forward in designing that. And I think templates, to the extent that instructors are aware of the importance of consistency, at least within their courses.
yeah.
The other thing I think is important for them to realize, in an academic setting, your course usually, unless it's the first course in a curriculum, it usually has something preceding it and something following it. It's really important you figure out where are students when you're getting them. One of the problems I see, and I'm dealing with it immediately, is where people don't like where students are and they set prerequisites, but the problem is those prerequisites are not realistic to expect. And they need to lower and it's not lower their standards, but they need to get real about where students are starting as opposed to where they want them to be starting. And it becomes worse as you go further through university as opposed to better.
Right.
I'd say at the CEGEP level and even at the lower undergraduate level, I think instructors are a little bit more realistic about that one.
Cool.
It's a good question, though. Still working a bit on how I apply this in face-to-face classroom setting. Think about the journey that students have. How welcome do they feel? One little trick that it's an advanced trick. If you have a really big class, but I believe you teach in, I apologize, Jen, I think you teach in CEGEP, you said.
Yeah.
And so I don't know how many class sizes are capped at yours, but at others it's 36. So it's possible to get to know all your students and call them by name. If you just do that, it's real easy to blow off a teacher who doesn't know who you are. As soon as you know their name, and this is one of the things that's we really know from the online experience, but I've learned in the face-to-face experience, students who feel anonymous don't really care. And why should they? We don't care about them. Why should they care about it? On the other hand, if you just pay attention to the student, calling them by name, it's one of the most powerful acts that you can do. It's amazing how that will actually engage them. And I think that's a good start. And then go further and then think about your experience and focus on one thing at a time. You don't have to fix everything at once. You get new, and then often one discovery leads to another. How can we help students? Hold on, Andrea had a question. How can we have students adapt to different platform styles and standards in online and blended learning? There's no simple answer to that. Especially now, it's a really timely question. The best thing I can say is just assume that whenever you begin, don't assume anybody knows. And this is, I think, the big assumption that we begin with in higher ed. We assume people know. And then our next statement is, well, they should know. Well, I think this is really, how about this one? They don't know, nobody taught them, and why should I be making the false assumption? So orient people. And then when I was in corporate life, they always used to say, but if you give them this basic information, it's like you're insulting the other's intelligence. You know what? They may have forgotten too. So it's not insulting. You could say, some of you may already be familiar with it, but I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. There's all kinds of wiggle words you can use. And the other ones who think they should know and are afraid because they know that everyone thinks that they should know and really don't know, you've given them permission to not know, which is the greatest gift you could have given them. So just always begin by just orienting people to the environment and also encouraging, say, look, I'm giving you a really quick orientation, but if something is confusing to you, don't feel bad. And if you want to private message me so you don't have to ask everyone, I won't mention your name as long as I recognize it was a private message, I hope. But yeah. I think also the personas, thanks, Monica. The idea of personas is really important because as you're preparing the class, it gives you someone to think about. And for those of you who are teachers like you, Jen, as you're preparing next year's, you're going to have a different group of students. But I don't know about you, but I find that over time, there are certain archetype students who keep recurring. And if you have that student in mind, those archetypes, you're going to be in great, you're going to be designed for those different archetypes. And usually many of them are in the class at the same time. You're going to be able to be sensitive to all their needs. So I think we're at 5:01, which I've kept you a little bit longer. But I want to turn it back to Jen, and I'm just going to put up the slide with the EdTech book on it, the Learning Experience Design book on it, excuse me. It's from the edtechbooks.org. It's so great to see so many people I know. I'm really excited to see them. And I want to thank everybody for being here. It was nice to have a friendly audience.
So actually, I want to thank you, Saul, for giving us such a great presentation and discussion. And I want to thank everybody else as well for participating really well and sharing your different thoughts and ideas and engaging in the breakout rooms and so forth. I don't know. I know this is being recorded, so it will go up somewhere eventually. I'm just not too sure where. So any of the stuff that Saul has presented, you can probably be able to find them there. But I'm sure you can always message him if you need a little more detail on the links and so forth. So thank you very much for attending, and I guess have a nice rest of your evening.